At 25,000 feet, the world thins into a simple idea. Hold the line. Engines drone in a braided hum that makes your ribcage feel like part of a machine, and the bomber stream, B-17s and B-24s shouldering through winter air, looks less like a formation than a moving city with windows full of faces you will never meet. Somewhere ahead, the target is a blur of intelligence reports and flak maps. Somewhere behind, the home field is a rumor with coffee. Between those places, one rule changes everything: stay with the bombers. The Tuskegee Airmen did not write that sentence, but they made it a doctrine. They flew it like a promise and turned a line in an operations order into a discipline that beat experience, ego, and bait. Their Mustangs wore red tails like punctuation, and wherever those tails appeared, German pilots learned that a clean intercept would become a dirty surprise. The tactic began with a refusal. Fighters like to chase. They like to pounce and peel and brag with the language of angles. The red tails taught themselves to ignore that appetite. They stacked above and slightly ahead of the heavy formations. One flight high cover, one flight forward cover, one flight floating to plug gaps when the sky wrote new problems. They watched vectors, not paint schemes. A target that dove away without commitment was a decoy by definition. A target that closed within gun range of a bomber lost the right to finish its sentence. The 332nd Fighter Group turned that grammar into geometry. They were not the first to speak it, but they were the ones who said it without getting bored, and boredom kills as efficiently as flak. Discipline feels like austerity until it saves a friend. Escort duty had a reputation. Less glamorous than free hunting, less decorated, more likely to end in a flak burst that did not care for the difference between skill and luck. The red tails inherited that reputation and burned it down by example. They did it in stages, because stages were what the war gave them. First in P-40s with short legs and stubborn hearts, then in P-47s that climbed like they were angry at gravity, and finally in P-51s that married range to teeth. Each airframe taught a slightly different sermon, but the altar never moved. Do not leave the heavies. If a German fighter wanted a duel, he could find one above a bomber's wing where a red tail would meet him with the gun sight bright and the throttle in reserve. If he wanted to be clever, he could decoy somebody else. The 332nd did not reward clever with pursuit. They rewarded commitment with gunfire. On good days, the tactic looked effortless. The Mustangs drifted in shallow weaves that kept eyeballs fresh and kept the sun where it could be used as a weapon. A call, tally high, would thread through radios like an electric nerve. Lead would snap a simple order. Hold cover. Second flight cut left. You could feel the decision before you heard it, because this was the doctrine they had practiced until muscle could do the math. On bad days, flak tore at the bomber boxes and oxygen masks iced on the inside, and a gun jam turned an ace into a passenger, and the rule gave pilots something to hold when everything else shook. Stay with the bombers was not a slogan. It was a handrail in turbulence. The discipline did not come from nowhere. It came from a training pipeline that dignified repetition until repetition became pride. Tuskegee Army Airfield did not promise glamour. It promised standards. Cadets learned the taste of checklist ink and the smell of wet canvas in a hangar where instructors drummed patience into bones. Pre-flight was ritual. Maps folded the same way every time, pencils sharpened and taped, harness adjusted ruthlessly, oxygen checked with hands that did not trust the gauge alone. Instructors wore the calm of men who know that a cockpit is built from habits first and rivets second. The early squadrons of the 99th Pursuit, later the 99th Fighter Squadron, fought for the right to fight, then fought for the right to be judged by outcomes rather than opinions. The ground crews learned to make engines sing on time. The intelligence officers learned to brief without sermonizing. The operations staff learned to squeeze more miles from a day than a day had promised at dawn. Charles Hall's victory on July 2, 1943, one Messerschmitt claimed over Sicily, arrived like a bell ringing in a hallway lined with closed doors. The pilot was steady, the kill clean, and the cameras found what skeptics claimed never happened when black pilots flew: competence without asterisk. The claim was not merely a line on a board. It was a data point that made it harder for men to pretend that training could be segregated from truth. Hall's squadron, flying P-40s, had already learned a kind of escort before the P-51s ever wore red paint. They learned to cover bombers with less speed in reserve than they wanted and less altitude than they needed, which meant learning the art of denial. Do not give a German an angle for free. Do not give him a chance to drag you. Do not give him the satisfaction of seeing you chase. These are not flashy choices. They are choices that pay dividends seasons later when the group moves north and the missions lengthen and a new airframe gives the doctrine its final shape. Tuskegee's schools ran on the belief that a pilot's first job is not to kill or to survive, but to carry instructions into air and make them true. The instructors had flown enough bad weather to know how arrogance smells on a man's breath. They clipped it without apology. Students flew formation until the line was tight enough to carry confidence from wingtip to wingtip. They practiced weaves until the pattern persisted through fatigue. They learned to trust radio discipline because radio discipline meant the difference between a clean intercept and a flurry of overlapping advice that helped nobody. Every lesson had a second lesson inside it. You will be asked to prove something that other men are assumed to know. You will be given fewer chances to learn loudly, so you will learn quietly and uniquely well. That was a burden. It became a standard. The 332nd Fighter Group gathered squadrons and doctrine the way a careful man gathers tools, one for each job, none wasted. The 100th, 301st, 302nd Squadrons joined, and the ground got ready for the day when the line would stretch from Italy to Germany. The group's culture, long before the P-51, honored the maintenance sergeant who fixed an oil leak in the dark, and the supply clerk who guarded drop tanks like heirlooms. The rule, stay with the bombers, would later be written in mission orders. It was already written on walls and in habits when the first Mustangs arrived, fresh paint bright against the raw hunger of winter missions that would demand everything a pilot had, and then a little more. Airplanes are teachers. The P-40 taught humility, short legs, sturdy bones, the kind of climb that demanded patience, and the kind of dive that rewarded timing. The P-47 taught confidence, a turbocharged brawler that could carry a fight uphill, take damage like a heavyweight, and still insist on proper engine management or else punish neglect with a cylinder head tantrum. The P-51 taught distance and grace, a laminar flow wing that sliced miles into manageable pieces, a Merlin engine that sang at altitudes where men saw their breath freeze, and a range that meant escort could be a promise all the way to the target and back. The Red Tails took what each teacher had to offer and built a doctrine that did not flatter impulse. They flew the P-40's denial tactics while they waited for the P-47. They flew the P-47's climb and cover while they learned northbound routes. They flew the P-51's long-armed tutelage with a stubborn loyalty that turned numbers into outcomes. Fuel ruled the day more cruelly than any colonel. Drop tanks, the ungainly blessings slung under wings and fuselages, turned escort from hope into doctrine. They leaked sometimes, they complicated climbs, they reminded pilots to move their hands smoothly or risk tearing the sky with a fuel-starved cough. But they bought minutes and miles that had been unreachable in 1943. Engine settings became part of the escort prayer, manifold pressure held below the red, unless the bounce demanded it. RPM governed with a hand that knew the difference between now and in 20 minutes. Mixture leaned smartly at cruise and enriched greedily for the fight. Oxygen systems were checked so often that pilots could recite gauge behavior like a sonnet. In that thin world, a leak is not merely an inconvenience, it is a trapdoor. Radio made discipline visible. The group learned to treat frequencies like lanes and words like rationed ammunition. A bomber box does not need commentary, it needs geometry. High 2. Bandits 12 high, 30 right. Hold cover. The call stops there because the extra sentence costs seconds, and seconds cost men. The 330 seconds radio nets carried a tone that ground crews could identify through static. Calm, clipped, the sound of pilots who were not auditioning for legend. Brevity codes, practiced on the ground until they felt like reflex, allowed formations to flex without fumbling. Net control knew when to speak and when to listen. A flight lead knew when to release a pair with a single word and when to call them back with another. The longer the missions grew, the more the cockpit became a long conversation with fatigue. Pilots rehearsed rituals to stay awake without trembling. Chew gum, adjust trim in small bites, move your toes inside boots to keep blood honest, sip water before the mask turns thirst into foolishness. The discipline did not end when the shooting did. Recovery was part of escort, too. The Red Tails learned to bring their charges home through weather that made fields cry with mud, through diversions that turned a straight line into an afterthought, through nights when a runway's edge lights looked like a promise barely kept. Stay with the bombers extends to flare height. The first winter with P-51s stitched a new pattern into the sky. The Red Tails' flights flew a ladder, low cover tight to the bomber's vulnerable quarters, mid-cover offset and slightly forward, high cover reaching out as a hand against top-down dives. The geometry was not a secret. The discipline was. German controllers could vector fighters into the stream. Pilots could slant dive from sun or cloud and force a decision. The 330 seconds answer looked like neglect to anyone who didn't speak escort. They refused bait that pulled energy away from the box. They refused vertical chases that would turn a patrol into a rumor. They cut across the likely paths and waited for commitment, firing passes after the German had fired, not before, so that the bomber's threat was real rather than theoretical. That delay required courage of a different flavor, the kind that keeps your finger off the trigger until the job demands it, not until the ego permits it. Flak-forced etiquette. You do not weave wide in a barrage. You conserve altitude and options. You do not linger low over a target that has promised to reach up and write your name in black puffs. You do not argue with a lead who tells you to hold cover when the tracer waterfall says pursue. Flak is democracy for projectiles. Everybody gets a vote, and sometimes you are the ballot. The Red Tails learned to read the rhythm of batteries until the rhythm felt like weather. When the patterns opened a seam, they used it to reposition, not to strut. When the patterns closed, they flattened their weaves and kept eyes where eyes paid. Berlin had a gravity of its own. The approaches ran long and mean, with controllers on both sides shaping the air with vectors that sounded neutral and felt like destiny. The 332nd entered those days with a promise fresh in paint. Red Tails made the bombers feel watched over, and feeling watched over is a combat effect no manual measures. German pilots learned the shape of the doctrine the hard way. A pair would dive in, one staying honest and one shading out to pull a chase. The shade found nobody gullible. The honest pass found a Mustang waiting to convert closure into punishment. The more this happened, the more the doctrine paid an interest rate called hesitation. A second of hesitation at 400 miles an hour is a long distance in which to be wrong. Some pilots wrote down the small rules on scraps of paper tucked behind kneeboards. Keep the sun over your left shoulder on this leg. Don't be seduced by a fighter that crosses nose to tail at 45 degrees unless he shows gun flash. Don't fixate on your own target past one burst. Someone else is watching you. Cover is a verb. These notes did not make books. They made habits. In the briefing tent, the rule sounded monastic. In the air, it felt like teamwork so tight that you could trust a voice without seeing the face. This is how formations survive bad moments. Trust rehearsed into bone. The day that put a shine on the doctrine came late, when winter loosened its grip, but the war still bit. On March 24, 1945, Berlin missions tangled the sky with contrails and bravado. Jets were in the rumor mill, and more than rumor. Messerschmitt Me-262s that could run away from anything with a propeller if the pilot had room and fuel. They were fast. They were also prisoners of their own physics. The Red Tails understood that speed buys arrogance if you let it, and buys mistakes if you force it. You cannot catch a jet in a drag race. You can catch it where it must slow, at takeoff, at landing, at that moment in a climbing turn when the engineer's dreams meet a pilot's human limits. They stacked the coverage farther forward on that day, noses pointed toward the fields where jets would appear. The call came tight and cool. Jets airborne. The rule held, stay with the bombers, until a vector intersected with a commitment that threatened the stream. When the 262s arced around for head-on passes or slashing attacks, the Red Tails cut diagonals not at the jets, but at the jets' intentions. A head-on pass turned into a head-on problem for the attacker when a Mustang arrived on the exit vector with guns already warmed. A slashing dive became a longer recovery when a cover element forced the 262 to choose between speeding into a block of air saturated with .50 caliber and curving wide into a second block that had just become hostile. 3 jets fell that day to Red Tail guns, records naming the airfields, the altitudes, the bursts, and the doctrine turned a rumor into a report. The pilots who made those shots were not magicians. They were escorts doing arithmetic faster than their opponents. A jet in a climbing turn bleeds energy. A jet with a pilot watching closure can be teased into a choice he does not want. The Red Tails did not chase the impossible. They harvested the inevitable. They learned to read gear doors beginning to open and to pounce on final approaches with the restraint of men who know civilians live near runways. They fought where the odds got fair. The bombers they guarded felt the difference as a physical relaxation in shoulders that had been bunched for months. Stay with the bombers had made room for punish the committed, and together those rules wrote the day's headline in contrail letters. Berlin did not fall because of one mission, and jets did not disappear because of 3 kills. But the balance of fear shifted a degree. The bomber crews briefed for the next long haul with a touch more trust in the new speeds the enemy could muster. The German controllers fed vectors to pilots who had the tactical equivalent of a hangover, memories of being cut off not by better speed, but by better timing. That is what the doctrine did. It invaded timing. It made the enemy late by a second, and then punished lateness with a calm that looked like luck to anyone who had never practiced patience. Legends live or die on numbers. The Red Tail's ledger, extracted from mission summaries and group records, shows 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air. Seasoned adversaries pulled into losing fights because escorts made commitment costly. Their bomber loss rate, 27, compared to an average of 46 for other groups flying similar missions over similar misery, reads small until you translate it into faces and letters home. 19 crews who did not have to be replaced. 19 sets of families spared the telegram. 19 times a target received the exact tonnage planned rather than a reduced ration born of attrition. 96 distinguished flying crosses punctuated a culture that rewarded steadiness as much as audacity. And the pipeline that trained them produced 992 pilots, nearly 1,000 men credentialed not by novelty, but by competence, a river of skill that flowed from a field in Alabama to a sky over Italy to a line on a map called Germany. Statistics can feel clinical. In the debrief tent, they were anything but. A missions tally meant engines stripped by ground crews with smiles, meant a chaplain's schedule lighter by a notch, meant operations could plan farther ahead because the escort curve was trending toward reliable. The bomber loss comparison, in particular, became operational coin. Commanders tasked with apportioning scarce fighters to too many missions learned to treat red tail coverage as a form of insurance that paid off in tonnage on target. Crews requested them when they could. Requests do not win wars by themselves. They change habits in headquarters. That change shows up months later as a line item in a plan that assumes arrival instead of praise for it. The numbers also functioned as a corrosive on a lie. Nazi propaganda, echoed in quieter voices at home, had insisted that black pilots would underperform or crumble. Stay with the bombers did not argue with that myth. It outlasted it. Every mission completed as briefed, every calm radio call under stress, every unit statistic that refused to be exceptional except in the direction commanders loved. These eroded the myth the way wind erodes a bluff. The 96 DFCs were not ornaments. They were receipts for discipline under fire. They read to peers like evidence and to skeptics like punishment. Operationally, the statistic that matters most cannot be written neatly. Trust. A bomber crew that believes its escort will remain can fly truer formations, which tighten defensive fire and simplify navigation, which reduces time over target and exposure to flak, which improves landing rates at the end of a day that would otherwise be spent counting holes. Trust is a tactic. The Red Tails manufactured it at scale. Between missions, the doctrine lived as ritual. Pilots wrote letters that mentioned weather more than fear and food more than hatred, because weather and food are the currencies of an honest day. Ground crews slept in shifts under wings when the schedule turned cruel, their hands black with oil that no soap could fully persuade to leave. Crew chiefs learned to read a particular engine the way a teacher reads a student, whose plug fouls first, which magneto sulks in damp, which coolant line likes to whisper just before it leaks. The best chiefs made their pilots lucky. Luck is the word airmen use when they are too tired to list all the competence. Weather ran the base like a stern ant. Squall lines barged in uninvited, cold-soaked instruments until they lied. Crosswinds punished greed on short final. The Red Tails flew in this mess with a respect that looked like caution and felt like endurance. They did not need to prove bravado to themselves. They had other things to prove. Medics patrolled the line with thermoses and stern lectures about frostbite. Maintenance ran engine tests before dawn, plumes of breath and exhaust finding each other in air that pinched. The mess invented comfort with coffee strong enough to give a briefing voice a bass line. The chaplain kept his sermons short. Everyone understood that words that are too long steal minutes, and minutes are the most unforgiving ration. Small rituals multiplied. A pilot touched the red tail with a glove before climbing the ladder because superstitions are how hands talk to the part of the brain that is still 12. A crew chief tucked a photo under a panel as a promise to a wife who wouldn't see him for 2 more seasons. An intelligence officer ran a finger along a map line and prayed to the patron saint of pencils. When the scramble bell rang, rituals compressed into checklists. Once airborne, the world became the old argument with cold and distance, and men who wanted to kill you for reasons that receded behind the immediate geometry of closure and angle off. And through it all, the radio net held the tone that ground crews could identify from the motor pool. Clipped, calm, the sound of discipline moving through air. The doctrine's human cost showed up at night. Fatigue lives in the bones nearest the truth. Men laughed at jokes that weren't funny because laughter was cheaper than sleep. A pilot's hand trembled on a spoon. A mechanic stared at a spark plug like an oracle and found nothing, and then found something and fixed it, and saved a life he would never be credited with. Discipline consumes energy. The miracle of the Red Tails is not that they found the energy once. It is that they found it every time the schedule demanded it, and still had enough left to be decent to each other in the quiet moments. The stay with the bombers doctrine changed bomber formations in ways you can see on film if you know how to look. Boxes tightened by small degrees because crews trusted that cover would not wander off in pursuit. A tighter box means more concentrated defensive fire, cleaner navigation, and shorter time spent knitting a formation back together after a turn. The intercept math improved because escorts took ownership of the vectors. If an attacker came from high 2 o'clock with a dive that promised a slashing pass, the high cover already held the geometry for a crossing shot. If a pair tried a pincer from opposite quarters, the forward cover flexed like a hinge, forcing one attacker to adjust into a less efficient angle of attack, while the other bled energy under a watchful pair of Mustangs. Energy fighting, for the escorts, was a household economy. Do not spend what you cannot replace. throttle discipline kept reserves available for vertical moves that mattered. The P-51's Merlin loved altitude, but punished ham-fisted hands. Pilots learned to treat manifold pressure like a contract. Break it only when the mission's interest rate is favorable. A pilot who blew through his reserves chasing a decoy would find himself honest and empty when the real threat arrived. The group punished that behavior by quiet disapproval, which hurts worse than a lecture from a colonel. The standard wasn't written on paper because it didn't need to be. It was enforced by the sound of radios staying calm under stress. The geometry also required humility. A hot hand could make 2 kills and still fail the mission if a bomber box lost its shepherd. The doctrine taught men to be proud of days without tallies. Pride in zeros is a hard currency to mint in a fighter squadron. The Red Tails minted it by paying in outcomes. After-action reports with quiet lines, escort complete as briefed, minimal harassment, were trophies of a different kind. Bomber crews learned the geometry, too. They reported fewer ragged turns, fewer gaps opening on climbs, fewer sickening moments when a fortress in the outer element realized it had become a billboard for every cannon within 20 miles. The doctrine worked because it was not a fighter-only idea. It demanded a different kind of discipline from everyone in the stream. The legacy of the Red Tails does not fit neatly on a parade ground. It lives in procedures and in a quiet recalibration of what professionalism looks like. 992 trained pilots mean more than a number. They mean a pipeline, sturdy enough to ignore prejudice and honor performance. 96 distinguished flying crosses mark individual days when courage wore a grin or a grimace and radioed home as data. The 112 victories are easy to count and easier to misunderstand. They mattered, but the doctrine mattered more. It saved crews who did not know the names of their escorts and taught air forces after the war that politics should not be allowed to veto competence. Post-war, the lessons migrated into manuals written in the weathered voices of men who had learned to prefer results to romance. Escort became a science of timing and patience. Fighter communities that loved free hunt admitted that some days the highest service you can do is to make the enemy feel late and the friend feel seen. When the armed forces moved, slowly and then all at once, toward integration, the Red Tails ledger sat on the conference tables where arguments had to meet evidence. A military that wants to win cannot afford to ignore 1,000 pilots trained to standards and proven in fields where flak and fighters enforce honesty. The standard the Red Tails set, competence as rebuttal, discipline as tactic, walked off the flight line and into policy. The myth-breaking was not theatrical, it was administrative. Promotion lists with names that would have been excluded in 1941 grew longer. Training syllabi expanded. Conversions to jets in the late 1940s and early 1950s tapped men whose first languages in air had been patience and escort geometry. The idea that aviation is a brotherhood built on merit rather than myth gained a few more signatures. You can trace lines from the Red Tails to cockpits, whose glass now glows with screens and maps that redraw themselves. The radios have changed voices. The discipline sounds the same. What endures is not a color on a tail. It is a promise. Stay with the bombers sounds simple until you ask men to do it when every fiber of pilot instinct wants to chase a glint and write a line in a diary. The Red Tails made the promise into a habit. They did it enough times that the habit became a reputation, and reputations have gravity. German pilots adjusted because they had to. Bomber crews relaxed a fraction because they could. Commanders scheduled differently because math had become kinder. The war did not hand out easy days in exchange. It handed out cold and noise and grief and a ledger of names that would never walk into a bar again. The doctrine did not erase the grief. It kept the ledger shorter than it would have been. If you stand on a quiet runway and look down the center line, you can hear engines that are no longer there if you have read enough debriefs. You can hear the clipped calls and the scolded laughter, the oxygen hiss and the rattle of a canopy when a hand slaps it twice for luck. The red tails taught that discipline is not the enemy of daring. It is the precondition for daring that works. Their 100-plus aerial victories were not the point. They were the interest accrued on a principle deposited in training. Hold your place, think in vectors, punish commitment, ignore bait, and come home with the men you promised to guard. The numbers: 112 kills, a bomber loss rate of 27 against an average 46, 96 DFCs, 992 trained, are a way of saying that an idea flew, and that the idea had a tail you could see from a long way off. The next time someone tells you that discipline is boring, show them a film of a bomber stream turning as one, while red tails move like punctuation at the edge of the sentence. Boredom is what skill looks like to a stranger. In a sky where seconds decided between smoke and survival, boredom was a gift. It meant the plan was working. It meant the escorts were still there. It meant the city in the sky would complete its errand, and the men inside could write home about a mission that sounded uneventful, which is the best sound a war ever makes. The red tails did not change physics. They changed behavior. And in the thin air where war is mostly timing, behavior is destiny. The doctrine also scaled because it respected the one resource never replenished in combat: attention. A pilot has only so many clean decisions in him before fatigue makes shortcuts look like solutions. By removing the temptation to chase bait, and by hardwiring intercept geometry into formation roles, the red tails conserved attention for the moments that mattered. Gun passes within 100 yards of a bomber's tail, flak breaks that had to be flown by instinct, recoveries to muddy fields where crosswinds lied. That conservation, spread across months, becomes a rise in mission completion rates, which becomes pressure on an enemy's training pipeline, which becomes a strategic lever. It is elegant because it looks plain. Elegance in war is often a well-kept schedule and a quiet radio. The doctrine also scaled because it respected the one resource never replenished in combat: attention. A pilot has only so many clean decisions in him before fatigue makes shortcuts look like solutions. By removing the temptation to chase bait, and by hardwiring intercept geometry into formation roles, the red tails conserved attention for the moments that mattered. Gun passes within 100 yards of a bomber's tail, flak breaks that had to be flown by instinct, recoveries to muddy fields where crosswinds lied. That conservation, spread across months, becomes a rise in mission completion rates, which becomes pressure on an enemy's training pipeline, which becomes a strategic lever. It is elegant because it looks plain. Elegance in war is often a well-kept schedule and a quiet radio. The doctrine also scaled because it respected the one resource never replenished in combat: attention. A pilot has only so many clean decisions in him before fatigue makes shortcuts look like solutions. By removing the temptation to chase bait, and by hardwiring intercept geometry into formation roles, the red tails conserved attention for the moments that mattered. Gun passes within 100 yards of a bomber's tail, flak breaks that had to be flown by instinct, recoveries to muddy fields where crosswinds lied. That conservation, spread across months, becomes a rise in mission completion rates, which becomes pressure on an enemy's training pipeline, which becomes a strategic lever. It is elegant because it looks plain. Elegance in war is often a well-kept schedule and a quiet radio. The doctrine also scaled because it respected the one resource never replenished in combat: attention. A pilot has only so many clean decisions in him before fatigue makes shortcuts look like solutions. By removing the temptation to chase bait, and by hardwiring intercept geometry into formation roles, the red tails conserved attention for the moments that mattered. Gun passes within 100 yards of a bomber's tail, flak breaks that had to be flown by instinct, recoveries to muddy fields where crosswinds lied. That conservation, spread across months, becomes a rise in mission completion rates, which becomes pressure on an enemy's training pipeline, which becomes a strategic lever. It is elegant because it looks plain. Elegance in war is often a well-kept schedule and a quiet radio. The doctrine also scaled because it respected the one resource never replenished in combat: attention. A pilot has only so many clean decisions in him before fatigue makes shortcuts look like solutions. By removing the temptation to chase bait, and by hardwiring intercept geometry into formation roles, the red tails conserved attention for the moments that mattered. Gun passes within 100 yards of a bomber's tail, flak breaks that had to be flown by instinct, recoveries to muddy fields where crosswinds lied. That conservation, spread across months, becomes a rise in mission completion rates, which becomes pressure on an enemy's training pipeline, which becomes a strategic lever. It is elegant because it looks plain. Elegance in war is often a well-kept schedule and a quiet radio. The doctrine also scaled because it respected the one resource never replenished in combat: attention. A pilot has only so many clean decisions in him before fatigue makes shortcuts look like solutions. By removing the temptation to chase bait, and by hardwiring intercept geometry into formation roles, the red tails conserved attention for the moments that mattered. Gun passes within 100 yards of a bomber's tail, flak breaks that had to be flown by instinct, recoveries to muddy fields where crosswinds lied. That conservation, spread across months, becomes a rise in mission completion rates, which becomes pressure on an enemy's training pipeline, which becomes a strategic lever. It is elegant because it looks plain. Elegance in war is often a well-kept schedule and a quiet radio. The doctrine also scaled because it respected the one resource never replenished in combat: attention. A pilot has only so many clean decisions in him before fatigue makes shortcuts look like solutions. By removing the temptation to chase bait, and by hardwiring intercept geometry into formation roles, the red tails conserved attention for the moments that mattered. Gun passes within 100 yards of a bomber's tail, flak breaks that had to be flown by instinct, recoveries to muddy fields where crosswinds lied. That conservation, spread across months, becomes a rise in mission completion rates, which becomes pressure on an enemy's training pipeline, which becomes a strategic lever. It is elegant because it looks plain. Elegance in war is often a well-kept schedule and a quiet radio. The doctrine also scaled because it respected the one resource never replenished in combat: attention. A pilot has only so many clean decisions in him before fatigue makes shortcuts look like solutions. By removing the temptation to chase bait and by hardwiring intercept geometry into formation roles, the red tails conserved attention for the moments that mattered. Gun passes within 100 yards of a bomber's tail, flak breaks that had to be flown by instinct, recoveries to muddy fields where crosswinds lied. That conservation, spread across months, becomes a rise in mission completion rates, which becomes pressure on an enemy's training pipeline, which becomes a strategic lever. It is elegant because it looks plain. Elegance in war is often a well-kept schedule and a quiet radio. The doctrine also scaled because it respected the one resource never replenished in combat: attention. A pilot has only so many clean decisions in him before fatigue makes shortcuts look like solutions. By removing the temptation to chase bait, and by hardwiring intercept geometry into formation roles, the red tails conserved attention for the moments that mattered. Gun passes within 100 yards of a bomber's tail, flak breaks that had to be flown by instinct, recoveries to muddy fields where crosswinds lied. That conservation, spread across months, becomes a rise in mission completion rates, which becomes pressure on an enemy's training pipeline, which becomes a strategic lever. It is elegant because it looks plain. Elegance in war is often a well-kept schedule and a quiet radio. The doctrine also scaled because it respected the one resource never replenished in combat: attention. A pilot has only so many clean decisions in him before fatigue makes shortcuts look like solutions. By removing the temptation to chase bait and by hardwiring intercept geometry into formation roles, the red tails conserved attention for the moments that mattered. Gun passes within 100 yards of a bomber's tail, flak breaks that had to be flown by instinct, recoveries to muddy fields where crosswinds lied. That conservation, spread across months, becomes a rise in mission completion rates, which becomes pressure on an enemy's training pipeline, which becomes a strategic lever. It is elegant because it looks plain. Elegance in war is often a well-kept schedule and a quiet radio. The doctrine also scaled because it respected the one resource never replenished in combat: attention. A pilot has only so many clean decisions in him before fatigue makes shortcuts look like solutions. By removing the temptation to chase bait, and by hardwiring intercept geometry into formation roles, the red tails conserved attention for the moments that mattered. Gun passes within 100 yards of a bomber's tail, flak breaks that had to be flown by instinct, recoveries to muddy fields where crosswinds lied. That conservation, spread across months, becomes a rise in mission completion rates, which becomes pressure on an enemy's training pipeline, which becomes a strategic lever. It is elegant because it looks plain. Elegance in war is often a well-kept schedule and a quiet radio. The doctrine also scaled because it respected the one resource never replenished in combat: attention. A pilot has only so many clean decisions in him before fatigue makes shortcuts look like solutions. By removing the temptation to chase bait and by hardwiring intercept geometry into formation roles, the red tails conserved attention for the moments that mattered. Gun passes within 100 yards of a bomber's tail, flak breaks that had to be flown by instinct, recoveries to muddy fields where crosswinds lied. That conservation, spread across months, becomes a rise in mission completion rates, which becomes pressure on an enemy's training pipeline, which becomes a strategic lever. It is elegant because it looks plain. Elegance in war is often a well-kept schedule and a quiet radio. The doctrine also scaled because it respected the one resource never replenished in combat: attention. A pilot has only so many clean decisions in him before fatigue makes shortcuts look like solutions. By removing the temptation to chase bait, and by hardwiring intercept geometry into formation roles, the red tails conserved attention for the moments that mattered. Gun passes within 100 yards of a bomber's tail, flak breaks that had to be flown by instinct, recoveries to muddy fields where crosswinds lied. That conservation, spread across months, becomes a rise in mission completion rates, which becomes pressure on an enemy's training pipeline, which becomes a strategic lever. It is elegant because it looks plain. Elegance in war is often a well-kept schedule and a quiet radio. The doctrine also scaled because it respected the one resource never replenished in combat: attention. A pilot has only so many clean decisions in him before fatigue makes shortcuts look like solutions. By removing the temptation to chase bait, and by hardwiring intercept geometry into formation roles, the red tails conserved attention for the moments that mattered. Gun passes within 100 yards of a bomber's tail, flak breaks that had to be flown by instinct, recoveries to muddy fields where crosswinds lied. That conservation, spread across months, becomes a rise in mission completion rates, which becomes pressure on an enemy's training pipeline, which becomes a strategic lever. It is elegant because it looks plain. Elegance in war is often a well-kept schedule and a quiet radio.